And we'll just wait on participants are starting to filter in. Okay. Hello, everybody. How is everybody doing today? I hope you're doing well. My name is Keto Pilek. Of course, I work for Keep Growing Detroit, and we are very happy to be talking about a really interesting potential crop for Detroit growers, which is rice, which is we'll get kind of into the nitty gritty of. But before we get into that, I wanted to do a little bit of just kind of discussion on, or just let you know kind of how this is going to work. If you have questions as we go along, please try and find the chat box and open that up. And if you wouldn't mind just dropping a little hello in there, it's a nice way to start out. You know, just we'll drop some highs to everybody. If you want to say how you're doing or what's going on. And I will be I will be kind of passing along those questions to our panel. As it turns out, we have a few panelists. John Edgerton is kind of our main panelist today. He's got the slideshow and he'll be talking the most. But we also have another rice grower, Scott Hucker, who's also a really great seed saver. He was at our seed saving event earlier this spring. And so he's going to be sharing some information. John, can you remind me of the third gentleman's name?
John Shirk.
John Shirk, who is who's growing out rice seed, and he's kind of working, you know, diligently to provide seed to kind of foster this idea for us to be going down this path. So without further ado, if we could give a warm welcome to John, and Scott. And I'll hand it over to John Edgerton to go ahead and start on his presentation here.
Thanks, Keto. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I coming through okay?
Just great.
Okay. So I just wanted to start off with saying I'm not great with technology. Thanks to my partner, Amy Duday, for helping me get hooked up here and for the invite from Keto and Keep Growing Detroit. I don't know if anybody that's on today was a part of the workshop last spring, early summer that I did at Keep Growing Detroit. If you're back with me, hello to you. And I did get a chance to see rice growing in Detroit at a couple locations when Amy and I came over for the garden tours, and that was really powerful to see. So I hope people are continuing with that. And I know that the kilo there at Keep Growing Detroit had quite a large patch of rice. And I know he was successful because I got a chance to see some of that at Mid-Michigan. I want to also just start out by saying a couple quick things, especially in relationship to the times we live in. I think this is real important to say, is that that rice growing in our country actually became possible because of the incredible knowledge and wisdom that was brought primarily by African-American women to the Carolinas. And I'll show a slide in a minute of two books that have been written about the African gift of rice and many other subsistence crops. But I think it's really appropriate with everything that's going on to give to give homage and respect to the incredible agricultural system that was developed in Africa around small grains. And I'm not just speaking here about rice. In the face of climate change right now, there are at least 3 or 4 other small grains and maybe more: sorghum, millet, teff, and there's at least fonio, many of which I'm only now becoming aware of, all of which have extreme drought and extreme weather tolerance, and may be a really significant gift to the world in times ahead. The rice that was brought from Africa is actually a different species of rice than the Eastern or strain. It's glaberrima, and it was the first rice that was kind of grown in this country. You know, one of the things I think that's important to say is in my family made early presents here, mostly from England and Scotland and Ireland, and I think they were mostly farmers. But the grains that they brought with them were not adapted. And if it was not for African Americans and for Native Americans, they probably would not have survived, because the adaptation of these crops helped them figure out a new way to garden until they learned how to grow those other crops well and adapt them here. So I just want to say that real quickly to finish that is that we, you know, in these times, thinking about the demonstrations and all the powerful work that's already been done in Keep Growing Detroit around an anti-racist food justice system, that it's really important to remember the heritage of resistance that's already gone on in that work, and that I have both I have some really profound grief around our culture that we have not supported Black and brown farmers. That's a long history that is another workshop entirely, but we have lots of work to do. Having said that, I want to move on, I think, to the first slide, and these are just some personal gratitudes. A lot of this work with upland rice that we're working with, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, could not have happened without the inspiration and vision of John Shirk of Shirk Seeds. And John's done probably more work than anybody that I know of trialing upland varieties from all around the world and figuring out what might do well in our Midwestern gardens. And so we all owe a big thanks to him. He's going to be joining us today, which is really, really wonderful. The other folks, and Scott and maybe Eleanor will be joining us, or Eleanor and Scott Hucker, that aren't too far from those folks in Detroit and in Ortonville, Michigan, and they run Great Lakes Staple Seeds. And Scott in particular has done a lot of work with some with rice, but a lot with the wheats and millets and sorghums. So we're gonna, hopefully we can link up and show a little bit of his trials there at the end of this presentation. And then these are the 2 books that I mentioned, Black Rice and In the Shadow of Slavery. Really powerful, inspirational books about the incredible diversity of African agriculture. One of the things that is remarkable is it took very late, almost up until the 1970s, for botanists and people to recognize the genius of African agriculture. And they thought that African agriculture had actually started much later than it had in the rest of the world. But what they now know is that the Africans really continue to allow the wild ancestors of the many of the crops that they were domesticated to continue to interbreed and create vitality and vigor in their crops. And so so it was hard to differentiate between wild and domesticated. But that process continues to go on to this day. And in terms of rice, there was actually a four-tiered system that we'll talk about a little bit maybe later on. But these books more go into that more detail, and I don't really feel like I have time today to go into that. So
John, let me just
yeah,
make a
sorry.
note here. No, you're doing great. Periodically, you're freezing for like 2 or 3 seconds.
Oh, okay.
Not sure if there's much we can do about that, but we'll
Sorry.
just, it's just one of those internet things. So let's just, um, we'll just try and continue on, but hopefully it doesn't cause too much trouble. But I just
Okay.
wanted to
Okay.
make you
All right.
aware.
I don't know why that's happening either. So I'm gonna just kind of do a brief slideshow through the process. One of the things I want to say is, although rice appears to be, I mean, to many of us, a mysterious crop, it's relatively easy to grow, and it seems to be at least very productive in our area. We have been focusing on upland rice, and what I mean by that is this is rice that does not require being grown in a paddy or underwater. Upland rices are grown around the world, particularly in highland areas or cooler areas. There's a difference of opinion, and maybe John and Scott can at some point um, chime in on this, but that the paddy rices are perhaps more productive, but that may only mean because of selection and lack of work on upland rices. There's a really deep interest now in upland rices, partly because the contribution that the huge acreage of that's donated or devoted to paddy rice is a critical issue about climate change and contributing to global warming. So, so there's been a real shift to thinking about this. But anyway, when we, just to start off, when we start seeds, you can see in the left corner, I've put some seeds and soaked them 24 hours. Usually that allows the seed to absorb the moisture. And then we go ahead and plant them. We use a soil block. I don't know if any of you are familiar with soil blocks. You could use, I would recommend at least a 50 hole tray. Rice develops a pretty vigorous root system quite quickly. We like the soil blocks because they really keep the rice, fills those blocks completely with the roots, and we get a really beautiful young plant. One of the things, in going back to soaking the seeds, the picture you're seeing now is actually some Amora, the variety Amora that I've just started 2 days ago. I'm allowing that. This is about 48 hours now. I'm starting to see little germination sprouts come on this. And I've gotten, so I actually let it go longer than 24 hours till I see the first early tips of germination, and then plant it into the flats. And then we get really quick emergence. Rice, in terms of transplanting out in the field, the neat thing about rice, once it goes into the that growth, and it's generally ready to go into field. Matter of fact, with rice, Keto, I'm just getting a notice that, okay, am I back on again?
You're good.
Okay, all right. With rice, you just, in about 3 weeks, it starts telling you that it's ready to go in the ground. It starts to yellow a bit. That means that its roots have kind of filled the soil plug, and it's ready to go. which is really kind of nice. It's not the long term transplant presence time like tomatoes or peppers or eggplants. So we're still experimenting, and maybe John and Scott can also chime in on this about planting distance. We generally grow our rice in raised beds. When we grew the Dehulling and the Lodo rice a couple years ago, we used a 9-inch planting distance. This year, in our trials, I'm using a 10 to 12-inch distance. It's going to vary from variety, but when you're thinking about rice, one of the things when you're looking at that little transplant, and you'll see some better pictures, you got to remember that this thing is going to expand. It's going to create more and more tillers. It's going to fill that space in. So this is a picture here in probably July, where the rice is starting to flower and pollinate. Rice is self-pollinates. Of all the grains, of the small grains of wheat, barley, rice, and oats and rye, only rye cross-pollinates well in the field. It's not that it can't, but at least so far, and John and Scott may offer other things, but we have not seen any crossing occur in the field. So we've been trialing the rice real close to each other. You can see in this photograph that the rice is starting to mature. In the right hand is the taller Dehulling. The Dehulling can get, well, it perhaps can get 4 feet tall. I'm sorry, I must have just gone to harvesting. I'll go back. Maturing seeds. So you'll also notice that you can see some fence posts in there. We also, the first year, put netting over our seed heads, partly because John growing in northern Indiana, John Shirk growing in northern Indiana, experienced quite a bit of bird predation. We have not experienced that here. I think once the birds find the rice, they'll probably go after it like they would any other grain. But we have not since used netting, and I say that with the knowledge that we may have problems this year. Harvesting, the way we harvest the rice, and you can see Amy to the left using a small hand sickle or a hand scythe. Those are really the best way to go, although I know John Shirk uses a special pair of scissors. I don't know what Scott uses, but we find with a sharp little hand sickle like that, if you hold the whole bundle of rice and just jerk through it, it creates a nice group. And then we tie 5 plants together in a bundle. Oops. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So then we take the rice inside in the bundles and hang them, allowing them to dry. Threshing, a bunch of different ways to do that. You have to understand we're doing all this on a small scale. If you reference back to the early slide of John Shirk and the acknowledgments, John has purchased a small little threshing machine, a foot pedaled variety, and we're kind of looking into that. But we just usually either strip the seeds or put the whole plant inside a pillowcase or an old feed bag and whack it with an old piece of garden hose, and that works really well.
John, can you explain what is actually happening with threshing?
Yeah.
What is it? What is threshing?
Threshing is actually taking the grain off the plant. And some of the rice varieties also have awns on them they have like a long hair-like thing on that protrudes out from the tip of the rice grain. So when we pound that, it releases the grains from the long panicle, um, and also from the straw, the dried straw of the grain, and then um, we actually we actually the first thing we do. This is the slide that I'm showing here is actually showing you winnowing after we've run it through the machine. But generally, after we thresh, because there's a lot of extra dust and stuff in there, we do winnow it using the fan. And I'm going to back up to that in just a second, but go back to this dehulling machine. Um, this is a this is the smallest model of dehulling rice that I kind of know of right now, built by Brill Engineering. I'm not sure. You can go to the web if you go to the internet and type in Brill Engineering, you'll find this. But this machine is hand cranking. It can also be adapted to a bicycle, and I believe there are some YouTubes on the internet that show this. But after the rice has been winnowed for the first time after threshing it, and then we run it through the dehulling, and it drops down, and the rubber wheels press the rice and remove the hull from the rice. And we get about somewhere between, depending how dry the rice is, about 80–90% dehulling the first time, and then we run it through again, and then we're pretty close to done. There's a few still that have hulls, and when we go to cook, those will float to the surface, and we just remove those. So,
John, I'm going to ask you to pause for 1 second
sure.
here. Okay, so there are a few questions coming in, and I'm going to encourage everybody, when you're posting questions, please post them to all panelists and all attendees so the group can benefit from the answers. And maybe we'll just take this second to answer a few of these while I'm interrupting here. So there was a question about, does KGD have any equipment to rent for this process? Not currently, but John has lent us their dehuller to process the grain that we had. So I think that either it's something that if there is enough, a critical mass of people growing, then that's something that maybe KGD could get a hold of. So I would say, like at this point, if you were starting grade next year, we're starting to try and build this as a movement in interest. So stay tuned on that, I guess. And then the next question, are you waiting for a certain physical characteristic in the plant or certain percent moisture when you cut the rice?
Really, that's a really good question. And this has been a learning experience for me in particular, because and I'm really thankful to John Shirk for this, because what little grains that I'd grown prior to rice always let the stalk completely brown, pretty much turn brown. And with rice, you can't allow that to happen. For one thing, you get more predation as it goes along. So what you want to look at is the status of the grain. Sometimes you can take one of the grains off and put it in your mouth and bite down on it. If you can bite it through, I mean, I don't mean hard, but if it's still gummy, it's not really ready yet. What you want to look for is a browning of the panicle itself, the top seed head, and maybe a part way down the stalk, but you don't want to wait until the stalk is completely brown. One of the things I think I can show you here. You might have to not share your screen. Okay. You want to do that? I wanted to, well, let's skip that for right now. What I was going to mention is there are two varieties of rice that we grew last year. One Amora that has a reddish cast to it as it matures, and also nigrescence, which has a blackish or deep brown cast to it. So it kind of has a built-in indicator that you kind of know that the grain is close to being ready to harvest. The other ones are just, they just have a brownish color to them, and you can tell that they're really drying. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. If Scott has some other things to
We
say, or
just
John.
we just lost Scott. I'm not sure what
Okay,
happened.
okay.
But when he comes back, I would like to. I'll keep an eye, and hopefully he'll
Okay.
pop back on, and we can
Did you have
get
anything
him into the
to say about that?
conversation. There's a few other questions, if we could. So, are the last three steps in order: threshing, dehulling, and winnowing, or threshing, winnowing, dehulling, or what? Could you kind of talk about the sequential?
Yeah, Keto, I think I'm wondering if we can just stop sharing the screen for a minute so that John can show some things on the video.
Yeah.
Let's do
Great.
that.
And looks like Scott's
Okay.
coming back on here too.
All right, so now John, you can show things. And well, I'll just say hi, everyone. I'm Amy. I'll jump in here. So I know for some people may be really familiar with the terms threshing and dehulling, and some people may not be at all, right? So I'm just going to hold up so, this is a stem of rice that you would harvest, right? So when we're threshing, what we're doing is we're taking these grains here and we're just taking them off the stalk, right? And so I'm doing that with my fingers now, and you can do this with your fingers. And sometimes this is the sort of thing I'll do if I'm watching a movie. Even as with our quantities, we try to beat them off, or John Shirk has the threshing machine, but you can also do this, as a wintertime thing and just pull them off. And then I don't know if you can kind of see, now I've kind of got a handful here. There we go.
Okay, great.
Of grains, but I can't eat these yet because they've got this hull on them. Right, and John was saying the hulls are sometimes different colors. So this sort of papery hull is not going to be edible there. So that's what the dehuller is to pop that papery hull off. So usually our steps are to do first some kind of a threshing.
Then
right?
we winnow.
Then we winnow, which is to blow off. Like even when I just pulled that handful off, I don't know if I can show you this with the video, but I've got some, even in my hand, I've got just kind of some loose chaff and sticks and pieces of that stalk. And if I poured this in front of a fan, I just kind of dropped it down like into my hand in front of a fan, those lighter chaff pieces would blow off and I would just get the handful of grain in my hand.
Right.
So we thresh and then we winnow, and then if we're going to be cooking it, then we dehull, and then we winnow again to blow those hulls off.
Right.
And then we probably dehull again to get the hulls popped off that didn't pop off the first time. And then we winnow again, and then we dehull again, probably 3 or 4 times.
Sometimes we don't know for all the varieties, but it depends. That depends how many times you have to dehull. Partly depends on how dry the grain is. The drier the grain, the more of the hulls generally come off, is what we find. And that seems like a lot of processes, and maybe it is, but they actually go pretty quickly.
Okay.
And I just wanted to say about the dehuller too. When we originally grew this, did our first trial, we applied to a Slow Food West Michigan, and they gave us enough money to purchase a pre-built dehuller. And I know that you guys have a Slow Food East Michigan chapter, so there might be ways to buy. Our idea when we purchased this was to make this Brill dehuller a community resource for people, because we were hoping to encourage more people. you know, the ideal thing, if we could ever get enough people growing in larger amounts, we could purchase a much bigger dehuller than this one. But this one does a good job. So.
And maybe we'll take a second to see if Scott wants to contribute to anything in the conversation thus far. Can you hear us, Scott?
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So, yeah, I was in my mind trying to organize notes. So, I'll turn on my video. We'll give that a shot. Start video. Coming through?
Yep.
So I plant my grains on a 9-inch row spacing. John mentioned wider. I had tried 8 inches in the past, but I found that 8 was too difficult for me to weed. My feet were wide enough and my vision bad enough that I would step on plants. So I switched to 9 inches. So is the video coming through okay?
It's a little, yeah, it's a little grainy, but it's good.
Okay, I'll hold still, which is normally difficult for me to do. Let's see, with regard to rice, we grow quite a large variety as well, like what our stock seed came from John Shirka as well, like John Edgerton's. Let's see, we thresh by hand, mostly just by grabbing the rice grains and stripping them off the stalk, like what they demonstrated. We do have a pedal thresher, but normally because we're selling seed, I'm separating the grain heads from the most beautiful ones, which go into the seed stock, from the less pretty ones that go into the eat stock. So I have to do that stem by stem in order to sort it all out. Let me walk to where the rice is. And as I'm walking, there's potatoes on the left and all kinds of beans. Here's some rice. Although rice doesn't cross easily, because we're a seed company, we try to have at least 3 feet between different plots of rice, just so they don't accidentally cross by touching, to be safe. This happens to be, is that coming through?
It's a little
This
bit
is a little
grainy.
plot of prima rice.
Okay.
Okay. So this is prima rice, and you can see the 9-inch between rows, and within the row, anywhere from 8 to 10 inches. Sometimes I lose a few plants from, they don't all make it. We do transplants into plastic cells. I use the trays that are 72 cells per tray. We can grow them about 2 weeks in the tray, and then they want to be transplanted. So we can't raise all the trays at the same time. We don't have enough space in the area in the barn where it's warm. We do it in 2 waves. So the second wave is about ready to be transplanted, maybe maybe in 4 or 5 days. You can see some nice little weeds between them. Rice, when you plant direct seed, and I'll show you some direct seed as well, you don't have to transplant. To me, rice looks like crabgrass, and I have trouble telling it apart until it gets this big. Then the stems, this is definitely may not show up, but the stems of a rice plant are kind of flat, and the weeds tend not to look like that. So once they get big, I don't get confused, but and we grow, for killing weeds, let me show you the tools. At the small scale, is this coming through?
No,
This is a hand weeder. This one happens to come from,
let me
how
pause
about
you
now?
for a
If
second.
I stand up, maybe yep.
Can I? I don't. Your screen froze for me. Is everybody else seeing that? Okay. Now.
I stopped the video and restarted it.
Okay. And also before you, just while I have you for a second, if you could also talk about when you're planting the first round and yields that you're getting per area.
Okay. We don't put the transplants out here, and we're in Ortonville, so the north of Detroit, just on the edge of urban sprawl. We don't put transplants into the ground until the very end of May, because we're trying to avoid frost. So we start them essentially in the middle of May, maybe or so, and then 2 weeks later we transplant them. I haven't done a good job of calculating yield per square foot. John Shirk has, and I believe he gets in the order of 10 pounds per 10 by 10 foot plot. Does that sound right, John Edgerton?
Yes, what it varies by variety, but we, like with the boreskin, and I took a middle ground of perhaps 100 square feet, roughly about 10 pounds of hulled rice. So you're going to lose about, once that's dehulled, you're going to lose about a quarter of that. So we're talking somewhere between 7 to 8 pounds of dehulled rice, finally.
Yeah.
John is posting here about 10 pounds is average for that. So
okay.
Thanks, John.
And I've never tried the wet variety of rice, although I lived in China. I know one of the advantages of the wet flooded rice is that in southern, where it's warm, they can plant 3 crops a year, 3 or 4. We, of course, in Michigan have the winter that gets in the way, so that would never work for us. So for weeding, you might use a hand tool like that and going around the plants. John uses a skull hoe, use this kind of diamond hoe. And then if you're really going to go crazy, this device essentially is like a tractor cultivator, but you push it by hand. And you see there's 2 cutter bars that are slide in the ground. You only have to keep one eye on the wheels, one eye on the cutter, one eye on the plant, and another eye on your feet, because it does require some coordination. Here's another plot of rice.
Excuse me, Scott. You're
through the
there. You
beans.
are. Okay.
Yep.
I think your video froze when you were showing the last tool.
Okay. Is it unfrozen now?
Yeah.
There. The old start stop.
Try one more time. There you go.
Oh, I see. It was the other way around. Okay. So this is Zerachara rice, and John Edgerton grew this last year, and they thought this was a very productive one as well. And we also see that it's really growing nicely right out of the shoot. It's been weeded, so it looks nice. This is like a 4.5, 5 foot wide plot, maybe almost 20 feet long of this variety. In terms of grains, small grains, because that was a theme of the class, there in the distance is some, that's buckwheat. That's Japanese buckwheat. I also grow territory buckwheat. You can make buckwheat flour and pancakes out of that. Let's see. Here are other plots of rice. You see, you know, this aisle is about 3 feet from plant to plant, so that's the spacing we use to avoid crossing. Let me show you the direct seeded, and you don't have to. If you don't have a lot of rice to plant, I would recommend the transplants, so you don't have to deal with the weeds so easily. This is direct seeded.
Breaking up.
It's probably damp for about 2.5 to 3 days. Inch to 3/4 inches deep. Excellent germination. Yep.
You're cutting up again a little bit. Okay. Maybe if you stood still.
No, I was sitting, and maybe I All right, let me start and stop. So let me start video. Any better?
Okay. Yeah, your sound was even a little bit messed up for a second there.
Okay, I guess I need Wi-Fi in the garden. So this is the direct seeded Dvorsky. You see, I'm going to have to thin and kill a lot of plants. That's way too thick. I didn't. I had really good germination. I planted them when it was dry. I didn't water for several days. I thought for sure things would be not so good, and I was very surprised. So we do direct seeded Dvorskian, and over here is some direct seeded Lodo. It's a risotto rice. These are plots that we always save seed from the earliest and the best looking varieties to save for the planting next year, and then the rest of these we're going to eat.
So can I make a note here? We're referencing a lot of, well, in particular for seed, so like in some varieties. So I'm going to ask maybe John Edgerton, to help me put together a list of resources for people. We'll get a link for John Shirk's company and some maybe like good varieties, one or two good varieties to start with.
Okay.
That's great.
Yeah, John, I sent you the link that leads to the presentations that we used in Midland at the seed swap for growing grains.
Okay.
You copy it from the email and paste it into the dialog box. That way people can download that. This happens to be a plot of corn. I think it's Minnesota 13. Apparently it was good for making moonshine. So we're planning to sell this one in a few years. So this is a trial plot. So far, so good. Is there any questions that are relevant to being out in the field?
Well, there was a question about water. Like how much water do these plants generally require?
We generally don't water them much. If it's like last year in the rice, I think there was 1 or 2 times in the summer when it was just really, really dry and the plants were looking distressed. But grains like this is emmer and einkorn in front of you. Grains are generally pretty drought resistant compared to like corn. Let's see. We also.
So would you say that you just a question here, would you say it's less watering than like say a typical vegetable garden?
Less watering. In fact, you could plan on no watering, and watering is only the last resort. Okay. So let me show you the sorghum. Sorghum is you can use sorghum to squeeze the juice out and make syrup, sorghum syrup for your cornbread, or you can eat the seeds like a grain. So the plant kind of looks like corn. Oh, wait, if I bend down, you lose the cell signal. So I've just started thinning this morning. This plant will grow about maybe 6 to 8 feet tall, and it's very prolific for making grain that you can cook, simmer in water like rice, or grind it into flour. And sorghum and millets are much more drought resistant, which is why we are exploring a lot of varieties of that to be more climate insensitive. So that's sorghum. Here's some other corn. This is Gaspé corn from.
Unfortunately, John or Scott, your video is frozen again. Maybe we could take a second and pause, and we'll see if we can come back, and we'll off a little bit, and go back to John Edgerton.
Yeah, I just and I'm seeing here Amy's pulled up the chat that John Shirk says that that upland rice has similar water requirements as sweet corn. I think that, of course, rice will soak up as much water as you'll give it. But I think the thing to remember is that at critical times, you probably need to think about not allowing rice to be water starved. And one is the initial planting or establishment. Make sure it gets plenty of water to get established. And then I think probably during a flowering and seed set, it probably makes sense if it's super dry to try to provide some additional irrigation. It's unfortunate we can't hear more from John, because John's done just an amazing amount of work with varieties and could tell us more about which seem to be more drought resistant. But I think what's really even more important is his trialing of early varieties that will help us in the upper Midwest to grow and be successful with some of these grains. And I think Amy just typed in asking him to recommend some of these. When I mentioned 10 pounds, roughly 10 pounds average, John has had a few varieties, I think, that have gone as much from 12 to 16 pounds to 100 square feet. But we still don't have enough people growing these things out in different areas, so we get better data. So
maybe we could come back to your slides for a little bit.
sure.
You want to go to screen share again?
Sure. Okay. One of the things I too want to mention about in terms of water is also keeping weeds down and cultivating. Scott mentioned a number of various tools that he uses. We use a little hand hoe to go, okay, between the rows. We've also been experimenting, and it's a timing thing. I've been experimenting a lot with sowing white clover into the rice after initial weeding to keep down the small weeds. It's a timing factor, but we've had some real good success once the rice has really begun to tiller a lot and maybe setting its first flowers, to broadcast the Dutch white clover in that, and that covers the ground nicely. Besides keeping weeds down, it also provides fertility, some fertility for the rice that year yet, but most of all, it provides a new bed for next year for other things to go in. So did you have a particular place you wanted me to go with the slides, Keto?
Oh, I just wanted to make sure that we got, had time to continue showing what you would put together for the presentation, and then we'll definitely have time for questions at the end. So
okay, so I just wanted this. I think I'll just maybe end up the slides. This is the slide that you're looking at right now, is a long 100+ foot bed of current projects. John Shirk shared with Amy and I 7 or 8 varieties of upland rice that come from Hungary and Poland. So the first group that you see, the first one is called Uba, OOBA. And we have small quantities. John is concurrently growing these in larger quantities at his place. And then beyond the rest of that are 9 varieties that John grew out last year, some of them upland rices. So trying to figure out ones that are very productive, that grow well. Like I said before, so far we've seen very few disease problems. Going back to harvesting, one of the problems that we've noticed is if you wait, and we did this the first year, we didn't know what the signs were to look for when the appropriate time to harvest. Is it gets later in the year into August as the seed matures, you get more and more in our region, we get more of that, those heavy dews on the maturing grain, that can cause some darkening. So it's really important to try to pick a key time when you know the grains are mature and avoid allowing it to stay too long in that prolonged August or early September time when the grains they can accumulate too much moisture in the outside. That will darken not only the outside husk, but will darken the grain a little bit on the inside. So far, when Amy and I have shelled that out, first we were worried about it, but we have, over the last couple of years, we have eaten that, and we haven't died yet, so we don't believe that that's a disease problem. So, but everybody's different in terms of their aesthetic likes of rice. So I will, I mean, I know there are a lot of questions, there are a lot of things I've left out. My apologies for partly the scattered presentation, but if there are other questions that I can answer, or Amy can answer, or John, or Scott, we're here.
Yeah, so I have a few questions, and then we'll go to a few questions that are in the chat right now. And
Okay.
just a reminder to everybody with both questions and replies, please make sure you're change the settings in your chat to all panelists and attendees so everybody can benefit from the questions and answers. So I just wanted to get a general sense of days to harvest. So we're talking about earliest planting on these. We're trying to avoid frost. So, you know, last frost usually in Detroit is like the beginning of May, but it sounds like just to be safe, maybe in the middle of May, you would start. And what's generally days to harvest? And then, yeah, I guess if you could start with that, and then we'll kind of continue from there.
Okay, so yeah, so now one of the things that Scott mentioned to avoid frost, my experience is that rice will take, well, I shouldn't say that. We've not had frost on our rice after we planted it late May. We've been fortunate in that, but we have had it experience light frost in the fall, and it seems to have some resilience to that. So it doesn't get knocked out like your some of your tender annuals in the garden. As far as maturity, the grains that we grew last year here, Amora, Zeratanica, which Scott brought up, Nigrescence, Lodo, Deborskian, all those mature in plenty of time. We're talking about from a May planting, some of them starting as early as here, and I'm always later than putting mine in than John Shirk, maybe a little bit earlier than Scott, but practically at the same time. And we're talking about some of the later ones maturing on into September. A few of them one of them that I grew last year, a purple jamon, which is a beautiful black rice, which is also fragrant. Marginal maturity here, but selected seeds from those that did mature, and I didn't grow it out this year, but we'll continue to try to select for earliness. So I hope that answers the question some. Scott and John may, of course, have other opinions about that.
Let's see. There was a question about ergot growing on rice as it does on rye. But I think John Shirk maybe replied to that. I don't believe ergot would be a problem with rice. I have seen tiny amounts of fusarium, but no major problems like with wheat.
Yeah, we've seen no ergot here on rice either. So
yeah. And then what size beds do you need to have 8 to 10 pound harvest? And that would be, we're talking about a 10 by 10 area, or however, 100 square feet, could be 4 foot wide by 20 or.
Right.
Right.
And that, of course, depends a little bit too on your spacing. You know, you're going to get more plants, like Scott plants at 9-inch spacing across the bed. You're going to get more in a 100 square foot area than our spacing of 10 or 12 inches. The thing, just want to say just one brief thing about spacing. One of the things that we're starting to learn about all these grains is that it seems counterproductive, but a little wider spacing allows all these traditional grains to tiller more. And they usually are actually can be more productive at a wider spacing and a few less plants. Of course, you know, that depends also on, you know, fertility of the garden. So, and the other thing is the wider spacing you make, though, the one negative of that is that leaves more space for the weeds initially to grow. And so until that plant tillers enough and expands enough to shade out the weeds, that's one thing you have to deal with. So, so there are pluses and minuses either way.
And just to clarify, the term tiller is where the plant sends out little runners out from the base of the plant, to ultimately making it taller, like this kind of thing, right?
Right. And each of those tillers are going to produce a seed panicle. So,
Okay.
so you know, some varieties, the least productive varieties may have anywhere from sometimes 5 to 10 tillers, but some of the more like Lodo, which is a risotto rice from Italy, and relatively dwarfing, it can produce 20 or 30. So, you know, and that's the case where you want to, you know, you think about spacing, because the more space it has, the more tillering it's going to create. The only problem is, like with Lodo, the problem that we've had is that I increased the spacing enough that it continued to tiller and didn't mature. So if you crowd it a little bit and force it, so it's learning that distance, and that's only can be done by regional work and experimentation in our gardens.
Could you talk about fertility? And then also, there's a question about rotating with, like, if there's any kind of rotation considerations, like rotating with vegetables or anything that you need to consider related to that.
We have not grown rice on the same ground twice. We tend to rotate. I mentioned that one of the things that's worked well for us is to grow the rice, interplant it with the Dutch white clover. And then we've turned around. We had some of the most beautiful broccoli and brassicas 2 years ago. Following the rice crop, we planted directly no-till into the Dutch white clover and allowed that to grow, and the brassicas grew fine in that. So we use that kind of a rotation. You know, the stubble of the rice, where we cut it off, that provides a lot of organic matter that breaks down for the next crop. Fertility, Scott and John can contribute. Our general approach in our raised beds is to add, we can never make enough compost here, so we try to do that. We try to turn in cover crops when we can grow them. And then we use, generally we use some Fertrell or an all-purpose organic fertilizer. And I use what I'm really strong on, the micronutrients are important. So add a little of what is called azomite, which is has a lot of micronutrients. And our soils here tend to get a little bit acidic, so I add some gypsum in that, which provides the calcium, but it has sulfur, so it adds the calcium, which rice really likes, but it doesn't change the pH. It doesn't make it, so it keeps it pretty neutral.
Our soils tend to be pretty basic here in Detroit.
Yeah.
They tend to be between 7 and 7.2 or something like that.
Right.
Is that a concern at all?
So if that's the case, and this is the big problem that I have with a lot of garden stores, they'll tell people, oh, you need lime. Well, most of the lime that's sold in garden stores is dolomitic limestone. And that has a lot of magnesium in it. And that's on a pH like in Detroit, that's not the thing to add. If you want to have more calcium available with that kind of pH, what you should be using is gypsum. It's maybe $1 or $2 more a bag, but it makes the sulfur interferes or keeps the magnesium levels down. So, so I don't know if that makes sense or not. Soil pH is something
Right. I mean, that's
Shelf.
just some general recommendation. That's a good start point, right?
Yeah.
Okay. There was some questions around using straw as a mulch. I'm sure that would be fine, right? Like once you have the stand gets up enough, then straw would be a great mulching.
Yep,
Let's
and
see.
so I think mulch is great. And then also there was a question earlier about using ducks for pest control. And I know there's some systems that use that, especially paddy type rice. We really have not had it yet. And at some point the pests may catch up, but as yet we have really not had insect pest or arthropod pest
No.
problems.
And like I
Great.
mentioned, we have not had the bird predation that John's had. Now, I will say, as the rice matured later in the fall, you know, we had some visits from some ground squirrels and mice and stuff, particularly some of the older varieties that may be in a shear wind lodged a little bit. And when I mean lodging, they actually tip over or break off. Most of the rice that we've been experimenting, we haven't had much problem with that. But so you're going to occasionally have that problem when the grain hits the ground. Although I did witness one day a beautiful little field mice that managed to work its way up a stalk, and it was just swinging in the wind, gnawing on one of these rice panicles. So it's not impossible, but they generally don't do that much damage.
There's
Okay.
another question about uses for the rice straw, and I'll just say for us, I think that's one of the benefits I see of growing rice is you get the grain crop, but you also get a straw crop. And so we use rice straw in our compost. We use it in our vermicompost bins instead of newspaper. We also use the rice dehullings in our the hulls in our compost, and we use it as mulch on other crops. So to me, the straw is a valuable product as well.
Okay. I guess open it up to Scott. Do you have anything else you want to add to the conversation here, Scott? Okay.
Okay, I'm unmuted. So I was adding my comments in the dialog box once I figured out how to do it properly.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've covered a lot of the bases. There are in the Zoom chat are a listing of some of the varieties as well as a link for John Shirk's seed company where you can get seed. And it sounds like Scott, you guys are working on making some seed available too. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, we're a company as well.
Okay, and Scott and his wife are their company. Could you add that your link to the notes too, please? And they're right outside of Detroit here, so that's a great thing to have somebody so close by. And I think we're covering a lot of the bases, so let's just keep it going with any questions. We'll keep it open for another little bit and see if there's any questions from the group. And then we might start to wrap things up after that. There's a note that both John and Scott's websites both have great resources too. So if you're looking for some reference when you're get down to it, those are going to be really nice resources to have at hand. Okay, John, do you have anything else that you'd like to add to the conversation?
Oh, I just want to, I noticed a question here about wild rice, and you know, wild rice is a different species. And here in Michigan, wild rice does grow, and many of the tribes in Michigan are trying to reestablish lake rice. There is also river wild rice, and it's I believe it's a slight variation on the same species. That's, like I say, that's different from the upland or paddy rice. But there is enormous amount of work being done by indigenous folks here in Michigan and all over the Midwest to maintain that traditional variety. It's a marvelous plant. I'm not aware of it, and this is a good question, if it was ever, attempt was ever made to semi-domesticate it, or it was always wild. I know that there was a lot of work to maintain rice beds, and if you look at treaty rights throughout the Midwest, there was great concern of the elders to maintain those rice beds.
Okay. There's a question, is it okay to grow within the city limits, or does it look too much like overgrown grass? Any luck with containers? So generally speaking, we are really advocating for folks who have gardens to be good neighbors and working, you know, as the city is getting better, slowly getting better at being a partner with gardeners in the city. We're just, you know, just generally recommending that people have good curb appeal. That said, I don't think if you have an established garden where it's a defined area of grass and then it's mowed around it or maintained around it, I think that's totally reasonable. So it's just a matter of, you know, just as long as you kind of maintain the entire landscape, you're probably not going to have an issue. My sense, and I'll let John answer this, but I guess, you know, in terms of containers, that might not be enough space to get much yield.
No, probably not. But I do want to say that, you know, when we came over and did the workshop, Kilo had, for attendees, people were able to take home, I don't know, 6 or 8 plants. And when we were back in Detroit for the tour in the fall, at least 1, if not 2 gardens that we visited, and I don't remember those people's names, and I apologize for that, but they had, both of them had rice growing in, you know, a good sized pot, and it was growing well. The yields wouldn't be great, but that would be a great way to experiment and find out what did well for you, and then thinking about the next year expanding that. I also just want to add, as far as varieties, you know, I said that we grew out 5 or 6 varieties. We have quite a bit of seed here. We're also willing to share small amounts with anybody that wants to experiment. It may be a little bit late this year, but we'd be certainly glad to send you seeds if you want to try some things.
This is Scott. When we came in the spring at the seed swap, I forget where that was. You know, where we set up the table and we're passing out seeds.
Right.
Yeah. If you do that again next year in the spring, we'll bring rice seeds. I think we had rice seeds with us, but most people didn't know what they were. Not many people took them.
All right. So something that we'll keep in the conversation for getting people on track with the right resources. There was a question, is it too late to start? And I think John this was posted right when you were answering that question, but it sounds like it's getting to be kind of too late at this point in the season.
You know, you could try, you know, if you wanted to try, we'd be glad to send you some seeds, some of the early ones, and then I would soak them like we did 24, 48 hours. So you see them starting to germinate and get them either in the ground right away or into a pot. That would at least give you some growing experience. I mean, Detroit has a expanded growing season. Your last frost in the spring is much earlier, and usually your last frost in the fall is much later, so it's a little bit longer. So we'd be glad to send you some if you try that. I noticed one other question here too, popping up about how was rice dehulled 100 years ago. you know, of course, they quickly in the Carolinas and stuff, I think by the 1800s, they had figured out ways to mechanically to begin to dehull rice. But initially, rice was dehulled with the technology that was brought from Africa was basically a mortar and pestle type technique, which required a great expertise to first dehull the rice. And even then, the demand, the growing demand in Europe for rice required that it be it then debranded. So the expertise among African women to take the rice to the next step without cracking or destroying it using that method was pretty amazing. You could still do it that way. You could still use a mortar and pestle. You could put the rice on between two boards and rub it. You would get a lot of the husk off. It's pretty labor intensive, but for a small amount to just try, you could do it that way. I think John Shirk also mentioned, you know, as far as a community dehuller, there are models out there for around $500 that are tabletop designs that will do a lot of rice at once. At this point, we're not investing in one, but if we could invest in something like that for as various communities, that would be really helpful.
So John, how do people get a hold of you if they want a little sample of rice? Through me or through email?
If you go to our website, Harvest of Joy Farm, we have an address there, right? Yeah, Amy?
Probably.
Okay. And there's also a way to
Okay.
Amy's going to type in the email address. So
Great. So there was a question that somebody tried to ask a few times, and I just wanted to kind of clarify. Can you grow outside of Detroit but still close? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, I'm not sure what somebody tried this a few times, so I just want to make sure that we're getting to their answer. But yeah, I think anywhere in Michigan would be reasonable to try this rice to answer that question.
Yeah, I know that John Shirk has sent seeds to people all over. Brennan of Poessa's Seeds in Traverse City has successfully grown Daborsky up in Traverse City area. I know of one person that is actually experimenting with rice, and I think trying again in Canada. I met a person in Wisconsin this summer who was growing in upper Wisconsin or maybe southern Minnesota. Of course, once again, these are trials. It can depend a lot on the season, but I think from a plateau from our area over here in Southwest Michigan, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, across to Detroit, we don't have quite the long growing season as John Shirk has down 100 miles south of us, but we're pretty safe with most of these varieties.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Scott. I from the growing degree days, the season, I think anywhere, the only place in Michigan I wouldn't recommend trying, be a tough challenge in the UP. They just don't have enough season. But that's down in this area, we're north of Detroit and we're in about 1,000 feet. So you're down in the lower lands. Definitely Detroit, you got a good chance.
Great.
You got the season.
Great. Okay, well, let's just say final questions, and we're going to wrap things up. Anybody else have anything else they want to ask these guys before we end up for the day? Okay. Well, while we're waiting, I'll just say thank you, John and Scott, and also John Shirk for jumping on the chat and contributing. Super excited that this has some real potential. John Edgerton and I were speaking when we were getting ready for this class, and just about that, we're doing pretty good with vegetables in our neck of the woods here in Detroit. But there's not a whole lot of people doing things like these kind of carbohydrates or high calorie crops. And then this kind of knowledge is just really powerful to start to develop, especially with these uncertain times. And this kind of this kind of knowledge is really helpful to have, just to know what to do as things develop. Again, thanks, and also thanks to Amy, John, Amy, and Scott. We appreciate you, and we'll wind things up there. And any final thoughts?
No, I don't think so. Thank you
Okay,
so much
all right.
to all of you for joining.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Have a good afternoon, guys. We get a little bit of fall creeping in for a second this weekend, but I'm sure the hot weather will be back before we know it. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, Scott. Bye, John.